Welcome, my friends, to a classic cars edition of NCIX Tech Tips. This right here is based on the very latest, most cutting-edge technology. It features a 1 gigahertz processor. And no, that is not on the graphics core. That is actually the CPU in here. This is a representation of AMD's dominance in 1999 by a couple of weeks, where they beat Intel to the 1 gigahertz mark. Now, that wasn't the only time AMD was out in front of Intel. Back in 2003 with the Athlon 64 K8 architecture, AMD was ahead of Intel in terms of performance, but not necessarily in terms of sheer clock speed. Well, now we are seeing AMD take that clock speed dominance once again. They are the first to release a 5 gigahertz commercial CPU with the FX 9590. So it took us a mere 14 years to go from 1 gigahertz all the way to 5. Now, it took some tricks to get here, and that doesn't mean to say that the tricks are illegitimate, it just means it took some fancy engineering. Now, Turbo Core 2.0 launched back with the FX bulldozer architecture in 2011. Now we have Turbo Core 3.0, which takes us from a maximum frequency of 4.5 gigahertz all the way to the 5 gigahertz that was achievable with the 9590. Now, with that said, the way Turbo Core works is it looks for the chip to have extra power available as well as thermal headroom in order to go from the nominal base frequency up to the turbo frequency. So in this case, the 9590 runs at 4.7 gigahertz. Then, if you have adequate cooling and you're able to supply adequate power, it is able to run at 5 gigahertz. Now, this is an important caveat because this chip has a whopping 220 watt TDP. That means to have the adequate cooling, you better have adequate cooling. Whoa, there's a whole bunch of stuff on the table all of a sudden. Now this, guys, is the reason why this processor was only offered to select system integrators before becoming available for mass consumption. Because you need a very special configuration in order to make sure that it's going to function correctly. So that 220 watt TDP basically means that unless you're running a very powerful air cooler, such as a Noctua NH-D14, or a pretty decent liquid cooler, such as a thick single 120 millimeter, or I would even recommend a dual 120 millimeter radiator pre-filled. So the example we have here is the H80, or you could use something like an H100i or an H110. You are not going to get enough cooling for this CPU at stock speed. Never mind once you start to overclock it. You also need a motherboard that is compatible, not only from a firmware or BIOS perspective, but also from a VRM design perspective. So an example of a board that will work is the Crosshair 5 Formula Z from ASUS. The reason that you need a beefy VRM is because this CPU, while being pin and socket compatible with any number of boards out there, could draw so much power that it actually burns out the voltage delivery system on the board. I have seen this before. Back in the Pentium D days, we'd get boards in for repair and the board would still be working, but you'd flip it over and on the back, the entire MOSFET area would be brown, would actually be like burned. So you don't want that to happen. You need to make sure you have one that has adequate cooling as well as an adequate design on the VRM. Last but not least, guys, make sure you have a decent power supply. Something like an HX750 or an AX850 would be a great choice, particularly if you're pairing this CPU up with something like a powerful graphics card or even a pair of them in Crossfire or SLI. Now, last but not least, I haven't talked about it much, but there's also the 9370. This one is clocked slightly slower at 4.4 base, 4.7 max turbo, and is also available at a more reasonable price. Because we haven't talked price yet, 5 gigahertz doesn't come cheap, folks, but if you want the fastest clocked commercial processor today, then you gotta pay to play. Now, to wrap this up, guys, I would like to contrast what a cutting-edge performance PC from back in 1999 looked like with what it might look like today. This is the FXN3 from NCIX, which features the 9590 CPU as well as a 7970 triple slot ASUS DirectCU 2 card. And if you want to check out a review of the processor, go head over to hardwarecanucks.com where they have a full review of this very unique CPU. And if you want to see in more detail what your modern 5 gigahertz computer might look like, check out the video on the NCIX Tech Tips channel here where you can get a closer look at this machine. I hope you guys have enjoyed this recipe guide on how to get your FX 9590 machine up and running. Don't forget to subscribe to NCIX Tech Tips for more videos like this from ncix.com.